in India right now, and lessons learned, and also what we should learn from what the Modi government has done in Kashmir, in Assam, through its legislation and so forth. And what we'll also talk about is what this all teaches us about the way the current international system is set up. So I am going to first introduce Raquib Naik. He is a multimedia journalist and editor, originally from Kashmir, currently based in the United States. He has nearly a decade of reporting experience covering politics, conflict, human rights, minorities, Hindu nationalism, refugees, and climate change. And he's reported from India, Kashmir, China, and the United States. Following him, I will introduce Mong Zarni, who is a human rights activist specializing in Buddhist racisms and state crimes in Asia, and in particular in Myanmar. He has 30 years of engagement in activism, scholarship, politics, and media. He's a non-resident research fellow at the Genocide Documentation Center of Cambodia. He's the co-founder of 4C, which is a all Pan-Asian human rights promotion organization. He's the co-founder of the 1995 Free Burma Coalition and Burmese coordinator of the Free Rohingya Coalition. Zarni is also an advisor on the Board of Advisors of Genocide Watch. And he served as a member of the panel of judges in the Permanent People's Tribunal on Sri Lanka. He was the initiator of the Permanent People's Tribunal on Myanmar in 2017 in Malaysia. John Packer is a distinguished associate professor of law, and he's the director of the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. He was appointed the inaugural Neuberger Jessen Professor of International Conflict Resolution in April 2018. He's also an experienced practitioner with over 30 years of working for intergovernmental organizations such as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, which investigated serious human rights violations in Iraq, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and extrajudicial executions, arbitrary detention, forced disappearances. He has, in other words, a vast experience. He was, from 1995 to 2004, senior legal advisor to the first director in the office of the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities. He was also the Constitutions and Process Design expert at the UN's standby team of mediation experts. His current research focuses on interethnic relations, minorities, and conflict, and his teaching, training, research, and writing, as well as advocacy, have contributed to the development of the evolving field of international peace, mediation, and I might add, international law. In fact, I think he's the best international lawyer I've ever met. So I appreciate very much your three being here. And I will open it then with Raquib Hamid, who will brief us on the current situation in India, how it compares to the Rohingya genocide and other lessons to be learned. So Raquib, you're muted right now. If you can unmute. There you go.
Thank you, Greg. I'll talk about Rohingya refugees currently living in India and the overall minority persecution, and also because Rohingyas are Muslims and they are non-citizens and living as refugees in India. So what is happening with them right now, especially with the rise of Hindu nationalism in India? So I have covered Rohingya refugees living in different parts of the country for at least 6 years, and especially after Narendra Modi government came to power in 2014. I mostly reported on their living conditions and issues inside the cramped and overcrowded camp and how they were perceived and received within the host community, and the overall rise of hostility post 2014. And let me say it on record, if anywhere in the world, Rohingyas might again potentially face genocidal massacres apart from Myanmar, it's India. There are more than 40,000 Rohingya refugees living in various Indian states like Haryana, Rajasthan, Delhi, Telangana, and then also Jammu and Kashmir, which is my home state. It was in 2008 when Rohingya Muslims started to come to India to avoid persecution back home. And the first few years were almost peaceful, but around in mid 2013, they suddenly found themselves become part of an aggressive anti-Muslim election campaign of BJP and other Hindu extremist groups. And it started in Jammu region, which is just 130 miles away from my hometown. Many xenophobic and Islamophobic stereotypes and tropes were used by Hindu nationalists to demonize, criminalize, and dehumanize them, from calling them a threat to the security of the state, being involved in drug trade, theft, kidnappings, to projecting them as a demographic threat to cities' Hindu majority population. All means of propaganda were used to generate hostility against them. And these were all fabricated lies with an intention to just uproot a very vulnerable population, even if it meant using violence. The anti-Rohingya propaganda that started from Jammu region made its way into the ruling BJP's nationwide anti-Muslim discourse. The negative sentiment and incidents of violence against Rohingyas in India over the last 8 years have seen a tremendous surge. The anti-Rohingya sentiment has peaked to such a level that a few years back, a trade body in Jammu put big banners and hoardings across the city, threatening to start their self-styled movement of identifying and killing Rohingya refugees living in the city if they don't leave the place. The Hindu nationalist government in India is actually working on deporting them back to Myanmar. In August 2017, they issued a circular asking all the states to identify and deport, quote unquote, illegal Rohingyas, without even mentioning the process. And just last year in Jammu, police detained hundreds of Rohingya refugees over the allegations that they don't hold proper documents and locked them in the detention centers. And most of them are still languishing in those crab jails without any legal recourse. The looming threat of physical assault from the far-right vigilante groups has affected their mobility, and most of the Rohingya refugees have stopped exploring the cities for work. They have just restricted themselves to their camps. The Rohingyas have faced tragedy after tragedy, and this cycle is endless and keeps repeating, first in Myanmar and now in India. In the last few years, their camps across India have seen various incidents of suspicious fire, turning hundreds of shanties into ashes, and many of them have also lost their lives. Police never investigated such incidents, but it is very likely that it is one of the tactics from the Hindu nationalist textbook to create fear and panic among Rohingyas and force them to leave on their own. So all of this brings us to the basic question: are Rohingya refugees safe in India? I believe, how can Rohingya Muslims be safe in a country when its own Muslim citizens are staring at an impending genocide? For Hindu nationalists, Rohingya refugees are very easy targets. First, because they are Muslims, and second, they are non-citizens. They are seen as less human, and any violence against them is seen as less of a crime by the Hindu national state. For them, they are just a human count, a number. 40,000 dead doesn't make a difference to them. Also, India doesn't have a national refugee protection framework in place because it isn't a party to 1951 Refugee Convention, but indeed, it does have a moral responsibility to protect them. But under the BJP government, which wears anti-Muslim hate and bigotry as a badge of honor, expecting morals, protection, and safety of Rohingyas is living like in a parallel universe. As we continue to see a spike in anti-Muslim hate speeches and violence, unfortunately, I believe Rohingyas living in India might have to undergo another round of displacement. That's a very unfortunate thing to say, but that's a reality. Thank you. Over to you, Greg.
Thank you, Raquib, and we will get back to you when we go into discussion. I'd now like to ask Mong Zarni to make his comments. As I say, we've known each other for years, and now it's such a pleasure to have his insights on what's happening right now in India.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Stenton, and also to co-speakers. I'm very honored to be included in your company here today. But as you will note, I'm wearing a shirt, saffron. I bought this in the Hindu holy city of Varanasi some years ago, and the reason I picked to I choose to wear this is to indicate that it is not Hinduism per se or Buddhism per se as a spiritual philosophy that attempts to tame humans' mind and assist them in their spiritual liberation, whatever the content. It is the abuse and misuse of Hinduism or Buddhism, for a rather sinister, in this case, genocidal mission organized by the state. The key word here is organized. I will touch on the Indian states and the ruling parties, and also the different organs of the state, including law enforcement agencies in India, right, are involved or implicated either directly or indirectly, but nonetheless materially in the process that genocidal scholars such as Professor Stenson himself call the phases of genocide. And so I believe that India is not just simply on the brink. India is already in the process of an unfolding genocide, and genocide just don't happen overnight. Yeah? It takes years of planning, organizing, and in this there is a very distinct parallel between both what the Burmese state, the military, has done to the Rohingya over the last 40 plus years, since the first wave of genocidal purge began in February of 1978. Yeah? This parallel, actually, I would say this is a universal element: organization, direct organized involvement of the state. Yeah? And here, the parallel between India and Burma is that Hindus in India are majoritarian society. They are the dominant majority, and the Muslims are only about 200 plus million. In the country with 1.4 or 1.3 billion population, the majority of whom are Hindus of various sects. And then by the same token, in the Buddhist Burmese society, of which I was a member, the Buddhists are 90% majority, and both India and Burma displays this majoritarian, paranoia complex. Yeah. What is so interesting and frightening is that the majority and the majority controlled states of India and Burma project the majority, the dominant, the ruling party, the ruling organization, including the armed forces, that are in the hands of the majority Hindus or Burmese Buddhists. They portray the majority as under threat, under siege from a tiny minority that is vulnerable. So in here, we can draw a parallel with Nazi Germany as well. The majoritarian German Nazi party that enjoyed, widespread support, what we will call populist support from the German civil society, including the Catholic Church. Yeah, portrayed Germany as under threat from a tiny Jewish population in Germany and Jewish population across Europe. And so what is so frightening is that the killers, the perpetrators of these intentional destruction of human groups, be they Muslims or the Christian minorities in India are also under threat as well. The killers portray the targeted victim populations as a security threat to the state, a way of life, to their religion. Yeah, and the other element is in this portrayal, what is so frightening is the ideological framing, the framing of people who are not part of the what is considered mainstream or dominant majority are portrayed as, the leeches, the mushrooms that flower on the German oak tree, right? In India, the Home Minister, no less, has portrayed the Rohingya as rats. Yeah. So when you have termites and rats, that sort of genocidal metaphors used by people in, extremely influential political or moral or spiritual positions, Hindu monks, Buddhist monks, generals, lawyers, actors and actresses. Yeah, when that kind of dehumanization begins, we can tell that that society is deep in the genocidal process. Maybe the killings have not started on a large scale, the parallel comparable to the Nazi killings, but this process over time deepens. And finally, my last comment is in the RSS, the organization that was founded in the 1920s, the parallel with the Nazi Party that was founded in 1923. Nazi Party was crushed in 1945, finished, and maybe there are currents of Nazi thoughts in Germany still, but as an organized ideological force, Nazism, fascism in Germany is no longer potent. But in India, it has been brewing, almost 100 years, and BJP is the fruit of this ideological brewing out of RSS. And so this is very frightening and very final comment. And genocides are not just simply single state crime. It doesn't simply happen within a national boundary. Genocides are allowed to unfold by the larger interstate system, whether it's a League of Nations time in the Armenia genocide, or all the genocides that have taken place since 1948 Genocide Convention was adopted. And so I think we need to look at both genocides both sociologically and legally.
Thank you so much, Mong Zarni. Wow, what a expansive and insightful observation. Now, John Packer is going to talk to us. He's very busy, by the way, watching what's happening in Ukraine, as am I, because both of us were very involved in Ukraine when it was just being born as an independent country. But he has taken his time away from that today and is going to share with us some of his thoughts about the parallels that he sees between other genocides, between the Rohingya genocide, and what's happening in India today. John.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks for the initiative and the generous introduction. I think the way I view, if we look at the world at the moment and these situations specifically, they are one of a piece. There are more than parallels. There are essential elements which are deeply disconcerting. And I want to talk a bit about the logic and also the logic that underpins the risks and the threat, in contradistinction of the logic of the post-Second World War rules-based international order, of which, in my view, extreme nationalism, the racism which is essential to it, and the genocidal tendency is a total repudiation of that Second World War paradigm. Let me begin by mentioning, you mentioned Ukraine. When I first started to work on the situation in Ukraine and Russia, formally in 1994-95, but a bit earlier, the early 1990s, I recall, I think it was 1992, a CIA estimation that the three greatest chances of nuclear war in the world were in this order: conflagration in the Middle East, Kashmir, and Crimea. That was the order. And at that time, you might recall, that was before the Budapest Memorandum of December 1994, the OSCE, with then CSCE, it became the OSCE in Budapest agreement. The memorandum is attached to the Non-Proliferation Treaty signed by Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Georgia. Belarus. And the memorandum were signed by, among others, Russia, that recognized not only the independence, but that was the quid pro quo, giving up the nuclear weapons for a contribution to international peace and security. This is the cornerstone. But it wasn't just that. And I'd like to come to this, what was the logic of this at the time? I do want to say that, the underlying nationalism as a political project and a paradigmatic precept of the nation as a kind of essentialist element is, first of all, an invention, a European invention of only a couple hundred years, or maybe a bit longer, but not part of the human condition for thousands of years. And some people have said, if we survive the current situation, it might even be a blip in history. But it's a pretty evil idea in the sense that I would say it has this tendency of becoming mass psychotic. And what I mean by that is the inability in extreme nationalism, the reductionist and form of suppressing the ability of humans to see one another, seeing the inescapable character of the human condition, which is about overwhelming similarity. The humans are essentially the same, and suppressing that and substituting it with a construction of extreme nationalism, which is essentialist, reductionist, and not just in othering in forms such as culture and religion and so forth, but that the being, the essentialist element of nation and membership defines and separates and necessarily creates hierarchy. That my nation is better than your nation, and and then the problem here is that this is manipulated by unscrupulous leaders who seek to be the epitomize the nationalists, often ironically, of course, that they are not actually bearing the same attributes of the group. Famously, Hitler was an Austrian, Napoleon was a Corsican, and so forth. But they seek to do this because they then mobilize the nation, the population in behind of these imagined ideas. Now, the Second World War, the experience, the first line of the UN Charter, in order to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, was a express repudiation of that idea, and a clear and firm statement not to repeat those evil elements, and this kind of what I would call European disease, to put it under constraints. And the constraints were, above all, the non-use of force to settle disputes. And the second was human rights. And the terminology human rights is everyone, not our people some places, it's everyone. It's a universalist concept. The exportation of the nationalist paradigm has, of course, continued, and is what we see in, I think, ironically, very ironically, in Asia. If we talk about Myanmar, India, it's an overt adoption of a European idea. It's often filtrated through Leninist concepts and so forth, but it's not an Asian initiative. It's an adoption, and then it's a perversion. And we've seen this in other places. I mean, if we look at South Africa, even if we look at the apartheid regime, It's not a surprise. It's not the white People's Party. It was the National Party, and so forth. So this kind of assimilation, of course, Milosevic and the Serbian nation, Milosevic, at the end of the Cold War, Greg, you and I saw it happen in real time. They tossed off their socialist clothing and simply replaced it with nationalist clothing. I mean, it was almost not a sleight of hand. It was an open exchange of substitution. But the contemporary international order builds on the logic of not only human rights, and don't forget the three purposes and principles of the UN are peace and security through this non-use of force and pacific settlement of dispute, the respect of human rights, even expressively articulated in Article 1 and Article 55, and a commitment to economic and social development on that basis. Now, human rights in this regard, I just want to spend a moment to say it is absolutely vital to understand that the human rights paradigm is not reduced to the individual in atomistic notions or purely individualist. It's clearly a group right. I mean, not least self-determination expressly, which is also included in the UN Charter, but more importantly, the notion of minority rights and this idea, picking up the attributes of human belonging, ethnicity, language, religion, culture. These are supported as part of and parcel of human rights, that persons belonging to such groups may not only they have a right to maintain and develop these attributes. And the idea here is to put a bulwark against unbridled majoritarianism, exactly what Dr. Zarni just talked about, where the tendency, it's not always the majority. There are countries where minorities in a rabid nationalist form suppress the entire population. But the general tendency is this assimilation of majority with nation and state, so-called state-forming nation, as a terminology used in European context, that they tend towards majoritarianism and they tend to perceive the minorities as threats and they tend to alienate. And we've seen this exactly play out in situations, including in the Eastern Ukrainian context. And this is vital to understand, that this is not just a matter of vindicating the human rights of all persons in the context and the modus vivendi, the living together requirement, the imperative of living together, because diversity is a fact. The only alternative logic is following the concept that the other poses threat, is to suppress, reduce, and ultimately eliminate. That becomes the logic of genocide. So here we must, for the modus vivendi, for our essential living together, for our global living together, we must vindicate human rights, including minority rights, including notions of self-determination, without resort to use of force. And then that requires not only a mutual respect, but a scrupulous insistence on the rules-based order in this regard. Now, in context of India, just allow me a couple words. I mean, here it strikes you in the face, given the enormous diversity of this, the second and soon or possibly largest population in the world, with its incredible diversity, that the project of a reductionist nationalist politics is plainly insane. This is why Gandhi rejected it, of course, and was so heart sick at the dissolution. And we saw what happened in exchange of populations and so forth. It was a total disaster. So if we acknowledge that diversity is fact, the character of the human condition is we are diverse in these terms, then diverse societies, which means all societies, even the putatively pure Norway or Japan, are actually diverse also. So in that regard, we have to say, we have to curtail this tendency of logic. And here it's not just a tendency. Here we are now faced with outright calls for mass violence. And this is an indictment on the leadership of these societies. Leadership matters. Leadership is key, I would say, at all levels, but leadership in these contexts is essential. It is the make or break difference. We're seeing the unbridled, extreme nationalist, really mad concept of Putin, but we're not too many steps from that in a Modi-esque invocation and those who he associates with and permits. And in this regard, I was deeply, deeply concerned at India's abstention from the Security Council resolution the other day. This was a moment if we look at the Myanmar paradigm, which is also overtly racist, the Myanmar concept of belonging and so forth is overtly racist. India Hindu nationalism is definitely the same genre. And what we need to do is stem that. And we are really getting at a stage of the late stages here where certain incidents are explosive and can, I mean, I don't want to underestimate the alarm that should be felt at the moment. This is late, this is urgent, this needs to be addressed. And with that, let me just say that, I mean, the longer term is education, forms of integration, autonomy regimes, and all the rest of that. But we must stop this right now. And this is of universal significance.
Thank you so much, John. And thank you for your sweeping understanding of history there. I think you're so right. I'm personally really impressed with the similarity in some ways to what our founding fathers in the United States faced when they said, we are going to protect minorities. In fact, the majority is what we're worried about. And so we're going to set up a federal system in which minorities are protected. In fact, we had George Mason here in Virginia saying, I won't even support the Constitution until you put a Bill of Rights in there. And so that is exactly what they were facing. And of course, the federal system in the United States got off to kind of a tough start. They didn't include the slaves and they, had, well, they didn't include women to vote at all, of course, until 1920. But we had a system of federalism that actually resulted in a civil war that cost 600,000 lives. So what we're looking at here with this attempt to deny minority rights, and probably the best example of it is Kashmir. It's the one majority Muslim state in India, and it was autonomous for a long time under a specific article of the Indian Constitution. And so Modi's now revoked that. And I think the parallels are unfortunately very, very real. We're going to have another genocidal trend there in Kashmir if we don't stop it now. And so what we have is a lot of parallels here. I just want to, open this up for your discussion of all of these issues, because you're so right about really how perilous the situation is. Raquib, do you have some comments about this?
Oh, yeah, of course. What Mong mentioned, what John mentioned about the parallels, especially with respect to what happened with Rohingyas in Myanmar. I think the very same situation is developing in India. Like you go from Kashmir to Assam to Karnataka now to Uttar Pradesh, all you see is total upright hate and bigotry towards Muslims. And the radicalization among young Hindus, I think in 21st century, if there has been mass radicalization anywhere in the world, it's India. The Hindu young men, they have been radicalized to such a scale that they don't see anything apart from anti-Muslim hate and bigotry. And the violence, the day-to-day violence, every day, there are stories. I'm a journalist. I every day follow news stories. Every day there is a story about a Muslim being killed, a place of worship being destroyed, and it is not happening in one part of the country. It's all over, from north to south, south to east, east to west. It's everywhere, and I believe the ground is being prepared for the genocide. And it's just one spark. And with the proliferation of the social media right now, with the reliance on technology, just one spark is enough to engulf the whole country. And that's very dangerous.
Greg, can I just come? You're muted. Greg, you're muted.
I'm sorry, I'm going to unmute. My interns are constantly reminding me of this. Anyway, go ahead, Zarni.
Yeah. What I see is another parallel, within the state of India, just as within the state of Myanmar under military, or like a hybrid Aung San Suu Kyi military government, that just ended a year ago with the coup. Another parallel is the weaponization of the law. The law is there to protect, the minorities and, to punish the perpetrators. So what happened is that in both Indian and Burmese regimes, whoever controlled the states, they have perversely turned the instrument of protection of humans into the instruments of murder. And, this is where the Nazi parallel is also very pertinent. As you know, like Nuremberg laws in 1935-38, Jews were de-Germanized, yeah, and they no longer belong. Yeah. Then later, they no longer they could walk on a particular street. They no longer live in a particular neighborhood. They had to be in ghetto, and all for their own good, for protections, right? So we have a similar situation. You look at like the citizenship law, national citizenship law, that struck 2 to 3 million Assamese Muslims, yeah, off the register that claimed them as Indians, right? Once the legal protections were removed, you have no recourse anywhere, within that state, yeah. And so that's why Martin Luther King Jr. rightly pointed out, that still is very poignant. Everything Hitler did was lawful, right? Nazi judges, the courts, and then the same thing happened with the Rohingya as well. As you all know, 1982 citizenship law. Citizenship was coupled with religion and ethnicity, right? Citizenship was or is or ought to be a membership of a political state. It should not have any coloration. Americans is an American. If I have an American citizenship, I am an American, despite my, communism or, Buddhism or brown skin color. It doesn't matter, right? So that is what happened within India and Burma. And then the other thing that happened internationally, while the law has been potently weaponized and instrumentalized in the internal process of genocide, destruction of minority groups, the international law has proven itself to be utterly impotent. That's why, Greg, you mentioned at the tribunal in Kuala Lumpur, by the time the court arrives, victims are all dead. So law has proven 71 years of genocide convention is proving to be a record of complete and utter failure. 71 years. Only 3 cases, once just started, and there are about 4 dozen genocides that have taken place. And so we've got this extremely disturbing legal parallel. Genocidal states weaponize the domestic law as an instrument to persecute and annihilate the minorities. International law and international governing institutions completely proven to be impotent. That is extremely worrying. The victims have nowhere to turn to, either within their national boundaries or outside their boundaries and within the interstate system.
John, you're muted.
Yeah, thank you. If I can jump in on a couple of things. So I share the exasperation that Dr. Zarni just expressed. And I think anyone looking at the world, and we're in the face of a genuine moment of nuclear threat, I don't see how you can come to any other conclusion than Dr. Zarni that there has been a kind of demonstrable failure here in terms of many of the elements of law. But I would just like to clarify where, in my view, we have to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. In my view, it's not so much the substantive content of the norms, which I think remain valid. What has been lacking here is and demonstrated is the ineffectiveness of the procedures. And for those of us in the field of law, we know that often one would say in the absence of procedural fairness, you won't get the substantive enjoyment of the rights and so forth. So we have two problems, I think, here. The structures that have been set up, and we just saw this with the Security Council. I mean, in my mind, there is no possible way to treat seriously the Security Council again, where one of the 5 principal guarantors of the whole post-World War Second World War order has just, in the absence of any possible good faith, vetoed a resolution by which it is overtly, plainly violating, aggressing, contrary to core tenets of the system. So that, to my mind, that's an issue of the design of the system. That simply has to change. The other problem here is the absence of an effective recourse for those who are, in order to vindicate their rights. Where do you go? I mean, this is a big problem. More than half of all conflicts in the world right now are self-determination related, and there's no place to bring a complaint. You can't, I mean, the human rights machinery explicitly rejects self-determination complaints, and there's no effective body. So we have to fix those defects, huge defects. But now, just to add 2 other things, picking up what you mentioned, Greg. One is, I would like to emphasize, and a lot of people might not grasp this, we focus, and I just invoke the notion of race. Conceptually, in the development of these notions, race is not actually a bloodline conceptual basis. That's genus. I mean, to use the Latin phrase, genus, and that's why we have genocide. But race actually came from the Latin and the Italian, the razza, and it's actually a cultural reference. And it was preponderant in 18th and 19th century Europe to speak about the linguistic groups. And so if you look at the First World War and all the cases of the Permanent Court of International Justice and so forth, it's the Polish race, the German race, the Albanian race. That was the concept. It wasn't about pigmentation of skin and so forth. This is, I mean, many Americans wouldn't understand that distinction. But whereas, in fact, it's the genus element, where we combine these, by the way, where we start to think that the race is the genus, is the ultimate. Now, the second point I wanted to make out, because, by the way, it is possible to deal with linguistic diversity in a way which is reconcilable. It is hugely problematical, and in my view, possibly not possible to reconcile genus distinctions. If we start to think that humans are fundamentally different and not fundamentally saying, we're in trouble. I want to just talk about the concept of majority, because the concept of majority came out of British English parliamentary, 18th century parliamentary decision-making and the majority rule. And we often talk about, and a lot of literature is about minorities as the problem. This is what Putin today called the Ukraine question. That was Hitler's notion also of the Jewish question. This is what others have addressed, where the minority is the problem. What was interesting, and that's what you mentioned, Greg, in the American historical context, is that the problem of minority differences is actually a majority problem. The problem is, what do you do if you accept a blunt instrument like majority rule? How do you get the minorities to reconcile and conform? That's a giant problem. People don't just say, "Oh, we'll toss off our linguistic characteristics or our religious faith and accept." So, what does a Hindu majoritarian society do about the hundreds of millions of people who are not going to accept that? And I think this is where the Indian problem is also acute, because of course, Hinduism is not a sufficient binary of people in India. Tamils are Hindu, or preponderantly Hindu. They are sure as hell not aligned with the core Hindu nationalist idea, because they're not going to sacrifice their Tamil ethnic and linguistic essential characters. So we have to give up this genocidal paradigm. We just must assign it to the dustbin of history, and we do have to look at this essential elements of how we live together.
That is, by the way, a reason why the United States has never adopted an official language, because they rejected that concept of, that you could, typology of people, was based on some kind of essentialist characteristic. And so that's why we have such amazing and wonderful diversity. It's why India does too. And this idea that the Hindutva is should be the way that India is organized is quite contrary to the Indian Constitution and to the dreams of the founders of India, Gandhi, Nehru, Ambedkar, others. So I really just, let's follow up on that a bit, because I think that I'd like to hear even more about what's happened in Kashmir, Raquib, because I know you're a real expert on that, because that is a perfect example of the denial of the rights of a huge group of people that are actually the majority of people in Kashmir.
Yes, Greg, of course. Very testing times for Kashmiris, and especially after August 2019, when India rescinded Kashmir's special status of Article 370. There is a military crackdown, and I would say since 2019, Kashmir is under siege. Like all the basic human rights and liberties that in the Indian state, they have trampled it all. Like us journalists, like a few days ago, last week itself, there was one journalist colleague who was arrested and jailed just for writing a story. And a week before, there was another journalist who was put in the jail. So India right now is committing excessive human rights violations in the valley. And to stop any information coming from the valley, they are shutting down all the media, all the forms of, be it social, be it news or traditional media, be it news websites, anything. They just want to block information from the region. And for that, they're going to, they're taking this next step of incarcerating journalists and harassing, intimidating them, intimidating their families. And even myself, like I'm a Kashmiri journalist, I am right now outside the country. Even I am not safe, and I cannot speak up my mind, because I know if I put anything out there, I write anything on Kashmir, my family is down there, they could be harassed, they could be intimidated. And it has happened over the last year 4 to 5 times when security forces came to my house and my father was called to an army camp. So the situation in Kashmir, I'm like, I cannot go in details, because I know very well whatever I speak here is going to come back to my family in next week or so. So, but the situation is really dire. You cannot even imagine, like, it's just the fear, like, when I was there in 2019 when India rescinded Kashmir special status. And on August 5th, I was traveling after after an assignment. I was shooting a documentary, and I got a call that Kashmir is going to be under lockdown. There is something major going to happen. I drove 200 miles to be at home. And in the night, I saw how everything changed, from police on the streets to army taking over in those fresh uniforms I still remember. And that fear in the air, and that fear is just increasing with each passing day. And Kashmir is just like an open prison right now. I would say I would not, make it equivalent to Palestine, but I think somehow it is reaching to that scale. And the Indian state right now is trying to change the demography of the region, because Kashmir is a very important part of the Hindu nationalist agenda. Without changing the demography of the Kashmir, they cannot achieve their goal of turning India into a Hindu nation. And for that, they have to change that Muslim majority character of Kashmir. And right now, they're giving lands to non-locals. A lot of companies from outside the Kashmir are coming in. They're giving free land to army members and their families. So it's in the progress, it's happening right now in front of our eyes, and we cannot do anything because the world has turned silent to our sufferings. And President Biden himself, when he came to power, there were very high hopes in Kashmir, because during his election campaign, he did talk about Kashmir. But after coming to power, he's the very same person who's having a bromance with Modi. I'm like, invited him to White House and never uttered a single word on what's happening with Kashmiris. So it's a very unfortunate situation in Kashmir. And the unfortunate part is happening right now in front of our eyes. We cannot do anything. That's too helpless.
And Zarni, the parallels of that to what's happened to Rakhine State in Myanmar are quite dramatic, aren't they?
Yes, I think also that, I will go back to Nazi Germany as well. because, like we talk about ideology, racism, like a religious nationalism, as if they were or simply, abstract pursuit of some kind of ideological mission or objective. Because, the truth is, like, genocides are also materially very gainful processes. If you displace 3 million people, that's like, properties, belongings, whatever, even, uneaten warm soup, yeah, or like leftover rights is, taken over by the perpetrators, the land, like, Hitler talked about, living space, like Ukraine and Poland, and, the same way, like if you drive out 1 million Rohingya, that's like a 40, 60 kilometers, in length, the fertile land, goes to the state, confiscated, distributed among the perpetrators, the local militias, Rakhine Buddhist communities. And so, and then, it's a Nazi gold teeth situation. As you know, the, concentration camps, a crematorium, had an architectural design just to melt gold from the victims, 1 million victims of like, Auschwitz. And then it goes straight to the Swiss bank. You see what I mean? And so genocides, my last comment, because I have to take the train, and so just 1 minute. Genocides are economically gainful processes. Yeah? That is, if you are part of the perpetrating group. But genocides prevention, or like, punishment, or deterring is not a gainful process. Yeah, war is a gainful process if you're on the right side of the war. Yeah, but genocides are never. Prevention is never. Punishment is never an economically profitable, gainful policies or practices. Therefore, we see Jews, left to be guessed by the millions. We see Armenians, like the slaughter, Rwandan slaughter, Rohingya slaughter. And then so finally, I think my greatest fear is that this Indian society has been primed. If you're a painter, you have to prime a society, to do the state's bidding. Yeah. And so the laws have been put in place. All the building blocks of a full-scale genocide are being put in place. The society is being primed because India has one of the largest media ecosystem, and 90% of Indian media is rooting for, like Islamophobic violence. And then finally, in every single genocide, victims are multiple groups. It does not stop with the Muslims. Yeah, and then look at Burma today. Those communities that led and supported the Rohingya genocide, they themselves became the targets by this very same genocidal organs of the state. So I'm going to have to run, and I apologize. I have to take the train. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Zarni. You've been a huge help, and your observations, as usual, are extremely trenchant. Thank you very much. And we will see you again, I'm sure. John and Zarni and I are kind of we're a trio that appears on Zarni's 4C podcasts pretty often, actually. One of the reasons is, of course, the ICJ case. And since John and I are both international lawyers, we've had a number of podcasts about that, and that really that does kind of bring about a questioning of how can law be used here, because one of the things that strikes me about India is it at least has a legal system, and that it has maybe not as much as it used to be, but a independent judiciary. It has a largely free press. It's not at all perfect. I know it's not as free as it was, but the one thing that I do hope for, and it has a civil society, the one thing I do hope for is that through pressure and change that is guided by Indian civil society and people opposed to this, that we'll be able to stop this. I'm hopeful of it. What do you think, Raquib? Do you think that we can stop this, or that Indians can stop this?
I'd like to comment on the two aspects you mentioned, the judiciary and the press.
Sure.
Unfortunately, I believe this, when we talk about the genocidal state, and this is what India has become, we look at all the different organs of the state, starting from legislative, executive, to judiciary, to even press. They all have been weaponized to target minorities. Look at the legislative. The same legislative, the same parliament, Indian parliament, passes laws like Citizenship Amendment Act, passes different laws that specifically target minorities. We go to judiciary, we go to executive. Look at what happened in Delhi, the role Delhi police and the Delhi administration played during the Delhi program of 2020. Look at the state of Uttar Pradesh, what happened during the anti-CAA protests in the state, and how they have been effectively and actively targeting Muslims since Yogi Adityanath came to power. And look at what's happening in Karnataka. Look at what happened in Assam a few months back, where a young Muslim man was shot and then a photographer stomped on his dead body. And when we go to judiciary, when all these gates of democracy, these organs of democracy have shut their door, you go to judiciary to seek recourse. But in India, the doors of judiciary have been locked for the minorities. Look at Kashmir, what happened in Kashmir. Kashmiris went to the Supreme Court, and I think till today, they had just 2 or 3 hearings. And we look at the Citizenship Amendment Act, there were a lot of PILs filed in our hearing. Look at the people, the young men who are being incarcerated in false and frivolous charges, whether it's Citizenship Amendment Bill or the Delhi riots, like cases of Umar Khalid. And then we also see Siddique Kapan in the state of Uttar Pradesh. The judiciary has closed its door for justice for Muslims and others who speak against this genocidal regime. And when we look at the press, they are playing a very active role in conveying the message of this genocidal regime to millions and millions of people living in different parts of the country. So I'm very pessimistic about the role that these state organs could play in restoring the normalcy. But yes, any solution to a problem has to come from the people. And I think the Hindu majority right now in the country, they have to realize that this radicalization is only going to kill that idea of India, and also ultimately going to affect them as well. It's not just the Muslim. As a society, as a country, India will break. There will be a civil war, and everyone will be affected as a result of that war. And I think Indians, Hindus, and people down there who are used to living that stable life, they won't have the stable life anymore if that happens. And it's just, I think, one spark that is going to engulf the country.
Thank you, Raquib, for your bracing analysis of the problems that face India because of these restrictions and these cutting backs of the constitutional protections for human rights that are happening now. I also, of course, very worried about the fact that international human rights organizations are being shut out. Amnesty closed its office. They passed this law that any foreign funding of organizations like that is illegal. So it's going to shut them down. And that's exactly what happened to Amnesty. Of course, they also were threatening prosecutions. So that is very worrying, because for those of us outside India, it really gives us very little that we can do much about. I do have some ideas here, maybe. One thing is that communications has become international. So we have things like this, this summit, and we can broadcast right into India, and that's very helpful. On the other hand, communications today also is a terrible vehicle and platform for hate speech. So we've got several trends going here. I've been reminded now by Ritu, who's really organized this conference, that we're coming to the end of our discussion today. Is there any other observation you want to make, John, before we end?
If you allow just one, because I wouldn't want to be to end on a totally pessimistic or some kind of inevitability perspective. I think that it is undeniable, as everyone has just said, and from Zarni's analysis, which I think empirically cannot be denied, Raquib's comments and yours, and right now, Greg, of the trends, the elements. This is why we should all be alarmed. But I would like to just a couple of counter elements in this regard. India is not only an enormous but diverse and globally integrated society. It has something like half of the world's natural scientists are in India. And if you study the work of international organization, I don't mean intergovernmental, the scientific world, as we've seen with COVID and so forth, is totally globally integrated. And Indian scientists, natural scientists, doctors, and so forth, their life is global. And a second point I would make is that India's per capita income now, I think, exceeds Russia. It exceeds a number of countries, with something like 300 million Indians in equivalent of middle class kind of life living standard, and their interests. So I want to talk about the range of variety of interests here, which are connected through telecommunications globally and so forth, are surely not reducible to a kind of extreme nationalist paradigm. It's not in their interest. I think we're going to see that in Russia too. So, but I do think there has to be deliberate effort, and that's what is disconcerting. And the tendency of the government seems to be clearly on the wrong side of this at the moment. So I think it's up to people. And I think that's my hope in the world. And Raquib said the same, that there are opportunities, there is possibility, there's actually size and weight of the people. And I'm hopeful, and I have some confidence that India will lead in this way.
Thank you so much. I am very happy you ended on that note, and I think you're right. So thank you to John, to Raquib, to Zarni, and we will end this session here, and we'll have another session coming up. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye,
Thank
John.
you.